Hi everyone, I hope you can all see and hear me well. It's nice to see so many of you here this evening, though I can't actually see anyone. So if you want to put your screens on, feel free to do that. My name is Heather Daniels. I'm a dietitian specialising in diabetes and weight management. For the past 12 years, I've been working for the NHS, covering outpatient clinics across the borough of Barnet, and I have my own private practice as well. Over the past couple of months, I've had endless phone calls from people in both my private and NHS clinics who have voiced their concerns about weight gain over the last couple of months, or the fact that their diabetes hasn't been as well controlled as it was before because of changes to their eating pattern or lifestyle during the lockdown. So that was the reason for this talk this evening, to give you my top tips for healthy eating during the lockdown and hopefully beyond as well. And of course, the all-important question, probably the question I get asked the most often, what can I snack on? So we shall be touching on that tonight as well. So in theory, as many of you might have thought at the beginning of lockdown, that it was going to give us the opportunity to have more time to focus on our health. So if you're short of time, normally this was the opportunity to do more exercise, possibly cook healthier food. But in reality, many of you have probably noticed, as I have, that that wasn't quite true. Often people are now working from home, possibly have small children at home and homeschooling. And that's really meant that we haven't had as much time as we thought that we might have. Many people have been shielding as well. And of course, that means that they haven't been able to go outside and do the exercise that they were hoping to do. So working from home and everything that came with that for many people have meant that you're actually eating more or just eating differently and being less active than before, which has led to weight gain and possibly the fact that blood sugar levels haven't been as well controlled. For those people worrying about their health, worrying about their diabetes, worrying about their weight, and hearing constantly on the news that if you have diabetes or you're overweight, you're more at risk of coronavirus. And for those who go on to get coronavirus, the outcomes are much poorer. I think we've heard now that 1 in 4 people who have died from the coronavirus have had diabetes. When you're hearing these things whilst you're worrying about your own health, that can make it a really stressful experience. So this talk this evening is for anyone who has type 2 diabetes or worried about getting type 2 diabetes, or maybe you just want to lose a little bit of weight and improve your health. So this talk will cover everything for everyone. And you're all muted at the moment. If you want to ask questions, there will be time at the end, and feel free to put your questions in chat as we go along. And with the time that we have at the end, I will go through the chat box and hopefully answer all of your questions, or as many as I have time for. So, coronavirus aside, diabetes and weight play a big role in health in the UK. I don't want to bore you with too many statistics tonight, but we do know that 4.7 million people in the UK currently have been diagnosed with diabetes. And we know that there are probably a lot more who just haven't yet been diagnosed. That figure, as big as it might seem, has doubled in just the last 20 years. And it means that in the UK, last year, 1 person was diagnosed with diabetes every 2 minutes, which I think you'll agree is quite a lot of people. Now, we don't know the reasons why everyone goes on to develop diabetes. It could be partly to do with ethnicity, it could be your age, it could be family history. But the greatest risk factor we know, and luckily for us, the one that we can change, is weight. Weight can contribute to up to 85% of all cases of type 2 diabetes. So that means that for all the people that did have go on to be diagnosed with diabetes, up to 85% of those people may not have been diagnosed if they had lost a little bit of weight earlier. So in short, there has never been a better time to get healthy. And tonight's talk, we're going to go through what we mean by healthy eating, and as I mentioned, the healthy snack choices that everyone is always interested in. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, there will be questions at the end for anyone who wants to ask anything. So just before we get started, another question that I'm being asked more and more at the moment is, what can I do to protect myself against coronavirus? People are always asking which superfoods that I can recommend, what are the 1 or 2 foods that I can eat that will help protect me from coronavirus. In short, really, as dietitians, unfortunately, we don't really talk about superfoods as such. So I know that in the media, we talk a lot about kale and blueberries, but we generally consider that actually eating well balanced diet is the best thing to do rather than any one food in particular. So each food has their own different minerals. The best way really to keep your immune system healthy is to make sure you have a wide range of vitamins and minerals, and then that comes with eating a wide range of different foods, which again we're going to talk about this evening. Sorry, questions come up on the chat. The sound is distorted. Is distorted for everybody? Can everyone hear me okay? One person is not making it here, or that it is distorted. If anyone can't hear, just put a message if it's distorted. Okay. I'm not sure what to say about that. I'm going to keep talking and hopefully I'm going to sort itself out. I'm not sure why. Okay, let me. Can anyone hear it well? Everyone is saying it's distorted. Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put a message in the chat. I'm going to go out and look again and see if that helps. Okay, I'm back. Can everyone hear me a little bit better now? One person saying yes. Okay, fantastic. Sorry about that, everyone. If you can't, then let me know in the chat. I'm going to keep that one down the side so hopefully I can see. Okay, so I don't know where the sound got left, and I'll go back just a minute or so just so we don't cover the whole thing. I think it was okay at the beginning. So we'll start with, we'll go back just a tiny bit for anyone who couldn't hear. So what I was just saying before was that one of the questions that I get asked most often at the moment are which superfoods are the best ones to protect against coronavirus. So in the media, they often talk about different superfoods such as blueberries, kale, whatever the food at the moment happens to be. And that's really a popular question at the moment because obviously everyone is quite worried about their immune system and coronavirus. As dietitians, we don't tend to recommend a specific superfood. All different foods have different vitamins and minerals, which are really useful for various reasons in our bodies. So what we actually do recommend is a wide range of different foods, which we will talk through this evening. And that will mean that you get a wide range of vitamins and minerals, which is really the best thing to keep your immune system healthy. Having said all of that, the one supplement which I do recommend is a vitamin D supplement. So many of you might be taking it already. Vitamin D is often known as the sunshine vitamin, and the reason for that, as you probably guessed, is that the main source of vitamin D is the sunshine. And although we've been really lucky with the weather over lockdown, generally speaking, in the UK, we don't really get enough sun. And many people are deficient in vitamin D. So even before coronavirus, many GPs were recommending that people do take a vitamin D supplement. There are also now some studies looking into the effect of vitamin D and coronavirus, because what the initial studies have shown is that the people who had the worst outcomes with coronavirus had very, very low vitamin D levels. The people who had better levels of vitamin D tended to do better as far as the coronavirus. So there's no definitive evidence on that yet. Obviously, research is still ongoing, but that's what the preliminary studies show. So that aside, vitamin D, as I said, is something that we're short of anyway, and it's not found in very many foods. So a vitamin D supplement is something that you may find useful. But other than that, we do really recommend trying to have a balanced diet and a wide range of vitamins and minerals. But I guess the question is, what do we consider to be a balanced diet? And again, as I keep saying, the most popular question, what can I snack on? So before we get to the snacks, I think it's really important to go back a step and talk about what we mean by a balanced diet. Because if we have well-balanced meals, that should mean that our need to snack is actually less. So what you'll probably notice for anyone who's skipped meals in the past, if you skip a meal, one of two things is likely to happen. So say, for example, you skip breakfast, you might even do really well and manage to skip lunch and think that you're saving quite a lot of calories. What tends to happen around 4 o'clock when people get home from work, or a little bit later than that, is you get absolutely starving. So you're home from work or wherever you've been, dinner's not quite ready, but you feel absolutely ravenous because you've had nothing to eat all day. What that normally means, rather than go to the fridge and cut some fruit or vegetables, most of us are going to reach for the cupboard and something that's much, much easier to eat that doesn't need any preparation at all. And that's when we usually eat things like biscuits, crisps, anything that's really easy and doesn't usually tend to be the most healthy of options. So what actually happens is all the calories that you've managed to save through the day, you end up just eating later on. For other people, they actually manage to make it through what I call the attack of the munchies in mid-afternoon and make it through to your evening meal. What then is likely to happen is that you're going to have a much larger meal because you're so hungry. And again, that's counterproductive. For people who are wishing to lose weight, it's not good for your metabolism to skip meals and then have very large meals. And if you have diabetes, again, it's not very good for your blood sugar control. What happens when you skip meals is that your sugar levels could get a little bit low. Be careful if you're on any diabetes medications, because that could actually make your blood sugar levels too low. But they could drop a little low during the day. And what happens later on, either through the sugary, fatty snacks or from the large meal very late in the evening, your blood sugar levels will increase quite a lot. In terms of the blood sugar control, that's not going to be very good for it. And even if you don't have diabetes, you might not be worried about the blood sugar spike because your own body's insulin will take care of that. But actually having very high levels of circulating insulin do promote fat storage. So essentially, what that means is it's much better to try to have 3 regular meals rather than skip meals and have larger meals later on, because actually normally that means a greater number of calories being eaten. And what we do know is that people who eat 3 meals a day do tend to be able to maintain a lower weight than people who skip meals. So I would definitely start with the 3 meals a day to start with. And that would always be a better option than what people talk about with the 5 smaller meals. So I don't know if you're familiar with that. People often say to me, should I have 3 meals with snacks or should I have 5 small meals? The 5 small meals is quite difficult to manage because what you're meant to do actually is take all the calories from the day and just split them up into 5 small meals. What
just break them down?
Is that most people will keep their 3 meals that they're having normally, and then they will just add a couple of meals as snacks, like little mini meals in between those meals. And so you actually end up eating more calories than you were before. So I would try to go for the 3 meals per day. So what should those meals consist of? And that's really important. So the first food group that we're going to start with are the carbohydrates. That tends to be the food group that people worry about the most and is in the media the most. Some days you'll hear reports that it's good for you and other days not so good for you. But we do recommend including some carbohydrate with your meal. So by carbohydrate, I mean foods such as bread, rice, pasta, potatoes, breakfast cereals. The starchy foods are the ones which will turn into sugar, and that's why people worry about them. What we know though is that our body does need some of that sugar for energy. So glucose is the main source of energy for our body. And that's really important to give your body the energy that it needs. If we include the more whole grain versions, so for example, porridge oats, shredded wheat, seeded bread, sweet potatoes, those are what we would call the better types of carbohydrates. So they're a lower glycemic index.
Just bring him down.
They turn into their sugars much more slowly. And so they're going to be very good for your blood sugar levels. They keep them stable and they help to fill you up as well. What people find is that when they eat meals which are very high in protein, it's very difficult to stay full. So people are feeling quite hungry later on, and that makes it very, very difficult to stop snacking. So I would always recommend including some carbohydrate with your meal. And again, it's a really good source of fiber. Most people in the UK are not eating enough fiber, and by having seeded bread and shredded wheat porridge oats, can really help with our intake of fiber. So the question really is, how much should we be eating? And I think that's really key as we go along with most of the foods that we're going to talk about. It's actually the portion size which is really important. So in terms of our carbohydrates, I don't normally weigh and measure food, but for the purpose of this evening, I have a little visual just to be able to give you a better idea of the kind of portion size. Just before I do show you though, it's important just to mention that, of course, being in a group, I'm giving quite general advice. Everyone's portion size will be different. So if you're 4 foot or if you're 6 foot, you will need different portion sizes depending on how active you are as well. So what I'm giving you tonight are just rough guidelines, but of course at the end you can ask me some more specific questions if you want to. So what is a portion of pasta? So I hope you're going to be able to see this clearly. This is what we would consider to be one portion of pasta. Now this is a snack bag rather than a sandwich bag, so it is quite a small portion, if you can see in terms of what my hand looks like, to give you a better idea. In terms of what most people would consider a portion size of carbohydrate, that might be a lot smaller. If I just show you the rice as well, so if you can see here, it fits quite comfortably into my hand, so that gives you an idea of the portion size. For anyone who is really interested, that's about 75 grams in dry weight. So for the pasta, that will roughly double once cooked, and the rice will treble. So that gives you just a rough idea of portion size. And if you wanted to look at that on your plate, which I usually suggest as an easier option, it should be approximately a quarter of a dinner plate for somebody who has diabetes or is hoping to lose a little bit of weight. If you're happy with your weight, and we would talk about nearer a third of a plate. But for most people, I try to guide them towards about a quarter of the plate. Now, if that's very different to what you're doing at the moment, I would never recommend going straight to that portion size. It's all about making improvements. So if at the moment you're having a whole plate of pasta, even going down to 3/4 of a plate of pasta is still going to be beneficial. And carbohydrate is something that often the portion size can be too big and we may not really think about it. Because hopefully we know that it is quite healthy as long as you're not cooking it with too much fat. We may not realize that that can be the cause of the weight gain just because of portion size. So for example, if somebody was to have a whole plate of pasta, say it's spaghetti bolognese or something similar, and the whole plate is the spaghetti, they might think, well, actually the portion size in total is not that big, but their blood sugar levels are very high, or their weight is increasing and they're not sure why. And it could just be the actual portion size of carbohydrate if we're talking about a quarter of a plate, and theirs is much larger than that. So I would try to stick to approximately a quarter of the dinner plate if you can, but as I said, reduce gradually. Does that make sense to everyone so far? Yeah, one nod's good, okay. If not, as I said, just message me and we'll try and sort out the problems. So that's the carbohydrate, and that should be approximately a quarter of the plate. We should also try to include some protein with our meal. So by protein, I mean foods such as meat, chicken, fish, eggs, beans, lentils. All of those are really important to keep our muscles healthy. The good thing about protein is that if we include it with some carbohydrate, so for example, if we have some fish with some potatoes, the protein can actually help those carbohydrates to turn into their sugars more slowly. So in effect, protein with carbohydrate can have a much more satisfying effect when you have them together. and they should always both be part of your meal. The downside with some of these protein foods is that they can be quite high in fat, depending on the types that you choose. Fat, as I'm sure you might know, can contribute to weight gain. But if you have diabetes, you're also at greater risk of heart disease. So it's important to try to limit the saturated fats. So the fat that we find in red meat, the skin on chicken, things like cheese, and the fats that you'll find in biscuits and crisps and those sorts of foods as well. So because of that, with red meat, which would be beef or lamb, we try to limit that to no more than twice a week. And we aim to have more chicken, turkey, and fish, and especially the oily fish like salmon, mackerel, sardines. They have a type of fat which is really protective for your heart. And it's good to try to include those a couple of times a week. For anyone vegetarian, or if you just want to limit the amount of animal protein that you're having, beans and lentils are a really good choice for your protein as well, as are eggs. So eggs are one of those things as well that the advice changes over time. And several years ago, there was advice that we should reduce the amount of egg yolks that we were eating and focus more on egg whites, because there was a theory that the egg yolks would increase our cholesterol. So many of you might remember everyone was eating egg white omelets and throwing away the yolks. But you'll be pleased to know about 10 or 15 years ago, that advice did change. What we now know is that eating a whole egg will not significantly increase your cholesterol. And a lot of the goodness, a lot of the vitamins are actually found in the yolk. So it's no problem to include eggs as a source of protein. And the British Heart Foundation suggests that up to approximately 10 eggs per week is absolutely fine to include, but of course be careful of how you cook them. So with all the other proteins that I mentioned, meat, chicken, fish, we should be aiming for approximately 100 grams in weight for those foods. And again, that should be about a quarter of your plate, roughly speaking. Any questions on the protein so far? No? Okay. So if the carbohydrate or the starchy food is taking up a quarter of your plate, and you have your protein taking up the other quarter of your plate, it probably doesn't come as much surprise to know that the other half of your plate will be vegetables. Now, by vegetables, it doesn't really matter whether you have cooked vegetables or salad vegetables, as long as you're including some vegetables. Again, I'm sure a lot of you will already know that vegetables are a really good source of vitamins, minerals, and fiber, but they're also really effective as a plate filler. So what I mean by that is very often people who come into my clinics aren't eating very many vegetables. They may not like a lot of vegetables, or maybe they just haven't really given it too much thought. What then tends to happen is that they will just end up eating more meat or more chicken or more potatoes. So there have been many studies, because so much of the way that we eat is psychological anyway. There have been lots of studies looking into how we feel when we eat. And what some of these studies have shown is that if you were to have 2 meals exactly the same in portion size, but one is on a small plate which looks very full, and the other is on a large plate which then looks a lot emptier, despite the fact that the actual meal is the same size, psychologically you will feel fuller after the smaller plate because that plate is full. So because of the fact that we don't like empty spaces on our plate, if you don't eat a lot of vegetables, you will much more likely to eat too much of the other foods. And again, that can be a reason why your weight or your blood sugars are going up, even if your total meal size isn't that big, because it's the proportions that you're eating of those foods. So the more vegetables you have, the easier it is to limit your portion size of the other two. So I would always suggest plenty of vegetables on your plate to help fill it up. And that will really reduce the number of calories in your meal as well. So the more the better as far as the portion size. And if you go for lots of different colors of vegetables, that's even better. All the different vitamins and minerals, all the different fruits and vegetables with different colors have different vitamins and minerals. So the bigger variety you can have, the better. So that's what we mean by a balanced meal. Approximately a quarter of the plate protein, a quarter of the plate carbohydrate, and half of the plate should be vegetables. If we manage to balance our meals in that way, what you should hopefully find is that your need to snack is less. Because if you're more satisfied after a meal, then you're not going to be as hungry in between meals. Having said all of that, that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be snacking at all. As I said earlier, what can happen if you don't snack is you get to your next meal a lot hungrier, and therefore the portion size is going to be a lot bigger. So for many of you, having a small snack in between meals can be really important, but it does depend on what you choose to snack on. What we want to try to do with a snack is to have something that adds a little bit of nutrition. So there should be a reason for eating it. It should add some kind of nourishment to your diet as opposed to empty calories, which tend to be sugary foods. But it also should be something big enough to get you from one meal to the next, but not too big that you're actually just adding in quite a lot of extra calories. So it probably doesn't come as very much surprise to any of you that fruit is going to be my top suggestion for things to snack on. Fruits are very high in vitamins, minerals, and fiber, and they're really a perfect snack choice because they're very low in calories as well. For those of you who have diabetes, you shouldn't really worry about the type of fruit that you have anymore. So again, this is another area where advice has changed over the years, and we don't really restrict the type of fruit that you have anymore, but again, portion size. So you'll hear me saying portion size quite a lot this evening. There is no fruit that is considered too sweet if you have diabetes. So you don't need to worry about things like grapes and mango and watermelon and all the foods that we typically told people many years ago to try to avoid, but more the portion size. So what we generally say is try to stick to what we would consider to be one portion of fruit at a time. So one portion of fruit, again, we use our hands quite a lot, so a fistful size, roughly one apple, so a medium-sized apple, or 2 tangerines, 10 grapes, that sort of size is considered a portion. And you can have 3 to 4 of these portions over the whole day, but make sure that they're spread out. So for example, if you have a banana with your breakfast, wait at least a couple of hours before you have an apple. And then any fruit should be absolutely fine to include. Again, like we said with the portion plate, if you combine your fruit, so the fruit has some natural sugars, which are a form of carbohydrate, if you mix those with a little bit of protein, that can have a more satiating effect. So many people do find that that makes it a little bit more filling for a snack. So for example, if you're having a piece of fruit, you might choose to have a few nuts with it, or maybe a low-fat yogurt, or some cottage cheese, vegetable sticks with cream cheese, or low-fat hummus. All of these means that you're getting some nutritional benefits. So you're getting your fruit or vegetables and a little bit of protein too. So it's a small snack to last you from one meal to the next, but it should be full of goodness as well. And portion size, again, is really, really key when we're including that. So I mentioned nuts before. Nuts are really great as a snack because they have the protein, which stabilizes the effect of the sugars. They're high in fiber, which many of us don't have enough of, and they're high in protein as well. So they're high in the good fats as well, which can be protective for your heart. So they are a great snack, but they're very, very high in calories. And although we hear in the media all the time that we should be eating lots of good fats, lots of nuts, seeds, avocado, we really need to be careful about the calories that come with all of those foods. And there is a point that you're having more calories than the cons are outweighing the pros, so to speak. So with nuts, there were some studies that looked into a cutoff point. So at what point are you actually just eating a lot of calories, which are going to outweigh the benefits of the good fats and the fiber and the protein? And the amount that was suggested was approximately 30 grams, which is an ounce. So for any of you who are wondering what that looks like, I have another little visual here for you. So again, this is a snack bag. You can see that portion size is really small. It fits into my hand. This is 30 grams of nuts. And it's about, not that I recommend anyone count calories, but it is about 150 calories. And it's really good just to see that in front of you, because what many people find with snacks, especially things like nuts, is that they're very, very easy to eat a lot of. So you can quite easily eat a handful of nuts before you even put the packet away. So one of the tips I would give for you this evening is to take a handful and put the bag away before you sit down with them. And these snack bags are really useful for that, because you can portion it out and then you're not overeating without actually meaning to do that. But with all these snacks, again, that's not to say that you can never have anything that you like either. I don't expect everyone just to have a piece of fruit, but it's about limiting the kinds of snacks that you're having and just thinking about what some of the alternatives to them might be. So for example, again, just a little visual for you. If we're looking at the fat content of different snacks, one digestive biscuit has about 3 grams of fat. So hopefully you can see that. Sorry, my voice is gone now. Hopefully you can see that in this test tube. If you compare that to a breadstick that has no fat, and a rogalach will have 8. So you can see the difference there. So sometimes it's just about thinking about what you're snacking on, how often you're snacking, and just going for a little bit of a healthier choice. So again, if we look at crisps, if you imagine just a regular individual bag of crisps, can you see that well, has about 10 grams of fat. The same portion size of pretzels has only 1 gram of fat. So it's just sometimes about thinking about the better options that you might want to have, or just thinking about how often you're having it. So one of the tips that I often give is something like dark chocolate, for example. A portion size, again, just to give you another little idea, is about 3 squares. This is Lindt chocolate, so it's quite thin, but about 3 squares would be considered a portion size. And what I often say to people is, rather than it's make a time that you're going to try to have that one snack. If you're allowing yourself just that one snack per day, possibly think about when you're having it. So if you eat that one snack that you've been really looking forward to at 10 o'clock in the morning, it's going to be really, really difficult to stay on track for the rest of the day. You'll spend the rest of the day fighting temptation, and it is going to be quite difficult. Whereas if you keep that the treat that you've been really looking forward to, or the last treat of the night, so for example, after you've had your evening meal and you're looking for something later in the evening, it makes it a lot easier to stay on track during the day, because you have that incentive of knowing that you're looking for something a little bit later on. So it's all about thinking about making things a little bit better than they were before. So we're never talking about having a perfect diet. I don't think there's such thing as a perfect diet, but it's just about thinking about how you're eating at the moment and seeing what you could do to make things that little bit healthier. So that would be one of my tips, would be to keep that snack for last thing at night. But another useful tip that people do often find quite helpful is to keep a food diary. Now, before anyone panics, I don't suggest that you keep a food diary every day, but it can be really useful just to keep for a day or two at times when you're struggling a little bit. So it could be that your weight is increasing, or maybe it's just not going down, or your blood sugar levels are higher than you would like them to be, and you're not quite sure why. Keeping a food diary can just be really helpful to let you look at what you've eaten over the whole day. And that's especially important during lockdown. As I'm sure you know, it can be really difficult to keep track of what you're eating, especially if you're at home all day. You could be going into the kitchen quite a lot, and we might have you know, a cracker here and a biscuit there, and you don't necessarily realize what you're eating when it's very, very small portions. But when you see that over the whole day written out in front of you, then that sometimes can help give you a little bit of an indication as to why things haven't been going as well as you had hoped that they would. Another thing that it can be really useful is just making you stop and think before you eat. So when you know that you're going to have to write something down, you do often pause, even if it's just for a couple of seconds, and think to yourself, do I really want to eat this? Now, sometimes the answer might be yes, and you might go ahead and eat it anyway. But even if just some of the time, that's enough time just to make you stop for a second and decide that you don't want to eat that, then it can be really beneficial just for that purpose. So keeping a food diary just for a day or two at times when you're not doing as well as you'd like, it can be something that's really useful to do. Okay, so we've talked about what we mean by a balanced meal. We've talked about the snacks and some of the things that might help us think a little bit more about what we're eating. But sometimes, and you might have heard this before, sometimes we're actually thirsty and our brain can't always tell the difference. So your brain might be telling you you're hungry, but actually you may just not have had enough to drink. And that's quite common, especially when the weather isn't good, which it often isn't here. You can get to the end of the day and just realize that you haven't had really anything to drink. And so it's really important, actually, just for our general health, for your kidneys, for your brain, for all of your cells to function properly, to make sure that you're really well hydrated. If you have diabetes and you're on any of the tablets that we call the gliflozins, so canagliflozin or empagliflozin, it's really important, or especially important, to make sure that you're having a minimum of 2 liters per day, because those tablets work on your kidneys. So that is really important. But for all of us, we should be aiming to have at least 2 liters of sugar-free fluids per day. So the best thing is always going to be water, but any sugar-free drinks would count towards that 2 litres per day. And it's, as well as keeping yourself hydrated, that can be a useful tip if you're feeling hungry, to have a glass of water and see if that helps. And sometimes you might find that actually you're not very hungry anymore. And other times you might still be hungry, but at least you still had that extra glass of fluid, which you might not have had before. So another tip I would give you is anytime, before every meal and every snack, it's a good idea to have a glass of water. It will take the edge off your hunger, and at the very least, you're getting a little bit more liquid in. But just be really careful, as I mentioned, with it, they should be sugar-free fluids. Although many of us know that things like Coke and other fizzy drinks are very high in sugar, fruit juices and smoothies are really popular at the moment. And I know a lot of people are making them themselves and have NutriBullets, which do tell you that that makes it healthier because you're not adding any sugars and you're putting the whole fruit in, so they're higher in fiber. Unfortunately, it doesn't really make much difference. And especially if you have diabetes, that amount of fruit is really going to spike your sugar levels. Even though the sugar in there is natural and it's fine to have a whole piece of fruit, when you're having it blended or juiced, you're having a much, much larger quantity. So when I said to you a few minutes ago that with diabetes, we should try to limit it to 1 portion at a time, in a smoothie, you might have 4, 5, or even more portions of fruit. You're blending it, that means that that sugar reaches your bloodstream a lot quicker. So it really spikes your sugar levels. And just to give you my one last visual, if we have a can of Coke, so this is a mini can of Coke, just to give you an idea, this one is a regular size, but this one is a mini one, it's half the size. There are 5 cubes of sugar in that small can of Coke, which means that in a regular size can of Coke, there are actually the equivalent of 10 cubes of sugar, which is quite a lot of sugar, but may not actually surprise that many of you. What might surprise you a little bit more is that in this mini carton of juice, which is not, it's actually 150 mils, so it's smaller than a lot of the normal juice cartons, there is the equivalent of 4 cubes of sugar. So it's actually not that different. So again, as I said, especially if you have diabetes, be aware that drinking sugary drinks will really spike your sugar levels. But for any of us, whether you have diabetes or not, all of that extra sugar will contribute to weight gain if we're drinking quite a lot of it. So do try to keep your drinks sugar-free as much as you're possibly able to. And of course, water is the best option if you can manage that. So all of those things talk quite a lot about all the calories that we're putting into our bodies. So we're very careful with portion size and how much food we're eating. But it's also important just to mention at the end that physical activity, or what we used to just call exercise, is also really important as well. If we're not burning off those calories, then of course weight gain is going to be more likely. So physical activity really means any form of being active. And that's why we try not to call it exercise, because it doesn't have to be going for a run or going to the gym. It's anything that means that you're being a little bit more active. So it could be swimming, it could be a dance class, it could be a YouTube video, absolutely anything that gets you up and moving is going to be beneficial. Ideally, you should be getting your heart rate up for at least 10 minutes. So you should feel your heart beating a little bit faster than normal. And that means that that exercise is also going to be cardioprotective. So it's going to protect your heart. Doing any extra activity will use up calories, and that's why it's really beneficial for weight loss. And if you have diabetes, doing any form of physical activity or any movement at all will start to use up the sugars that are in your bloodstream. And so that will really help to lower blood glucose levels. So for example, if you have a meal and you find that your glucose levels are really high afterwards, going for a long walk after your meal will help to bring those levels back down. And again, like I mentioned at the very beginning with what you're eating, any improvements on what you're doing. So the government recommend a minimum of half an hour, 5 days a week. But if you're not doing any at the moment, that's quite a lot to do. So I always recommend look at what you're doing and just make it a little bit better. So if at the moment you're not doing any physical activity, even going for a walk for 10 minutes every other day over the course of a week, that does really add up. And what you'll find is once you're in the routine, it's much easier to increase the frequency or do that little bit of walking or whatever it is that you enjoy for that bit longer. It's getting into the routine that's really, really difficult. And that really will help to use up some of the calories that you've taken in. So what you'll find is just by trying to cut calories, by eating less, many people find that quite difficult to lose weight. And again, just relying on burning the calories off during exercise will also make it quite difficult to lose weight. But if you combine the two, it has a much greater effect. So you take in fewer calories by eating a little bit less, whilst at the same time burn off more calories by moving a bit more. And that combined effect is really, really useful. And it's going to make weight loss much more sustainable as well, and really help your diabetes, keep your diabetes under control. So those are my top tips for healthy eating during the lockdown and hopefully beyond. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask? I can't see many of you, so if you want to either put your videos on, put your screens on, or put a question in the chat box, I'm happy to take some questions. No? Okay. Well, if you do think of anything afterwards, you need some, oh, sorry, one's popped up. Is the carbohydrate content of beans significant? It can be, yes. I mean, generally speaking, we would consider beans to be a protein source. So especially if you're vegetarian and you're not having any protein in your meals, beans can be a very, very good choice. It does contain some carbohydrate. So it depends on what your blood sugar levels are and how big your portions are, how significant that will be. But again, it depends on the rest of the carbohydrate in the meal. So it would need, I think probably depends on what you're doing and more specific information on that one, but only large portions would make it overly significant. Are there any healthier options for full fat mayonnaise? Always going for the lower fat mayonnaise is going to be a good idea. Be careful with them. Food labeling can be quite difficult to interpret well. Just because something says lower in fat or reduced fat or light doesn't actually make it low fat. It just makes it lower in fat than the original. So it's still going to be better than the original, but I would say try to be careful with the portion size as well. So try to use a little bit less. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Can you have too much fruit is the next question. You can have too much fruit, much more likely if you have diabetes, and that's just because of the amount of natural sugars. The best thing to do is to spread them out. So say, for example, you've had your 3 or 4 portions and you're thinking, well, is it going to be too much if I have more, or shall I have, and then if you decide not to have that fruit, you're going to end up eating chocolate or biscuits or something like that. I would always go for the extra fruit because at least you're going to have vitamins, minerals, fiber. But too much at one time is going to be the bigger problem with that. So try to spread your fruit out if you do have diabetes. How long would it take to bring down cholesterol with a sensible diet? That's a really difficult question to answer because it depends on what your cholesterol level was before. It depends on what you mean by a sensible diet, and it also depends on what your diet was like before. So the people who have the biggest changes to make will see the biggest changes. So for example, if you've drastically cut down on your saturated fat intake, for example, you'll see bigger changes than somebody who doesn't have as many changes to make. Normally, in terms of the amount of time, we don't know exactly how much time it would take, but most GPs will give you a 3-month trial. So what they'll say is, make changes to your diet and let's retest in 3 months and see if there's been enough of a change. Bear in mind also with diabetes, we look for a much lower cholesterol level because of the risk of heart disease. So in the average population, we look for a cholesterol level of less than 5.2. Once you are diagnosed with diabetes, that level needs to be less than 4. And that can be quite difficult for many people to achieve just through diet and exercise anyway. So GPs are quite keen to introduce statins, but as I said, they will often, if you want to, give you a 3-month trial period. So I hope that answers your question as well. Are there any other questions? If anyone has a question that they don't want to ask publicly, or you want something a lot more specific, feel free to contact me via the Shawl office, or you can contact me via the contact form on my website as well, which is www.expertdietadvice.com. But if there aren't any other questions here tonight, then thank you very much for joining me, and I hope it's been useful. Bye-bye.